6 leaders told him directly, "Do not do this." He nodded. Then he did it anyway. And the moment he did, 32,000 NATO troops standing in the Arctic cold became the most important image in the world, because what those troops represent just got a lot more complicated. Right now, in the frozen fjords of northern Norway, tanks are grinding through ice and boots are sinking into snow. 32,000 NATO troops from 14 nations are running live fire drills in conditions that would break most armies before the first shot is fired. Canada's Prime Minister is standing shoulder to shoulder with Germany and Norway. The message being sent to Moscow is unified, deliberate, and unmistakable. We are ready. But while those soldiers were sleeping in sub-zero tents, something else was happening. Quiet, deliberate, and aimed straight at the alliance those troops were there to defend. Here is what the Arctic exercise did not show you, and why the decision made that same night may matter more than anything happening on that frozen battlefield. Overnight, without warning and without debate, Donald Trump lifted sanctions on Russian oil. 6 G7 nations had told him explicitly, do not give Russia economic breathing room. Not now. Not while Ukraine is still in the 5th year of a war that has already killed hundreds of thousands of people. The British Prime Minister presented the intelligence. The French President addressed battlefield momentum. Germany's Chancellor, standing at that same Arctic base just hours earlier, made the direct case that lifting sanctions now would be a gift to the Kremlin. Trump heard every word, then he did the exact opposite. 6 against 1. No ambiguity, no miscommunication, no staff error. 6 leaders, 1 decision, made alone. That is unilateralism at a scale NATO has not seen from a sit-in American president in decades. And here is the thing. This was not a surprise, not if you have been paying attention. Trump broke ranks on tariffs. He broke ranks on Greenland. He broke ranks on Ukraine support. Now he breaks ranks on the one line allies called non-negotiable, Russian sanctions. At some point, the pattern stops being unpredictability. It becomes strategy. A strategy where America does not lead differently. It moves alone, without consultation, without alignment, and without accountability. So while Europe was reacting with fury, and while headlines focused on the fracture inside NATO, something else was happening in that same frozen corner of Norway. Something quieter, something the mainstream coverage almost entirely missed. And once you see it, the entire Arctic looks different. Canada did not panic. It adapted. And the numbers it produced on camera in Norway told a completely different story than the one being pushed in the headlines. The headline had looked brutal. 84,000 jobs lost in a single month. Canada's economy in freefall. The system cracking. And then, in front of a journalist who was not throwing softballs, Prime Minister Carney pulled out the data. Over the 6 months prior, Canada had not collapsed. It had added over 80,000 net jobs, verified by Statistics Canada, not projected. Then came the comparison. The United States, 11 times Canada's size, added just 6,000 jobs in that same period. And in that same February 2026, the US did not just slow down. It lost 92,000 jobs, more than Canada, in a vastly larger economy. The 84,000 job headline was 1 month inside a much larger trend. Wages were up 4.2%. Unemployment sat at 6.7%, lower than when Carney took office. The headline looked like collapse. The full data looked like adjustment. The media gave 1 month, 1 number, 1 narrative. Carney gave the full board. And the contrast, Canada absorbing trade pressure while the US shed jobs at a faster rate, did not fit the story being told about which country was under pressure. But the jobs data was not the real move. The real move was happening on the map. And this is the part that almost no one is explaining, because once you understand Canada's geographic position, everything that happened in Norway looks completely different. Canada controls 40% of its landmass and 75% of its coastline in the Arctic. It shares a 3,000-kilometer Arctic boundary with Europe, not politically, geographically. That boundary connects North America directly to the European Union's entire northern security architecture. When Trump frames Canada as though it were the 51st state, or questions whether it can defend its own north, he is not just poking a neighbor. He is destabilizing a critical NATO frontier. Germany's chancellor did not fly into the Arctic for a photo opportunity. Norway did not host 32,000 troops for symbolism. That frozen terrain is a shared line of defense, and Europe knows it. And while Washington was making unilateral decisions, Canada was making structural ones. A $40 billion submarine program, 12 submarines, with final bids from Germany and South Korea, Norway deeply involved. The United States is not at the table. That is not an oversight. That is a choice. Added to that, $35 billion in Arctic infrastructure investments announced the same week. Bases, systems, real assets. When a Norwegian journalist asked whether the United States could still be trusted in the North, Carney said yes, then paused, then corrected himself. What followed was not diplomatic reassurance. It was a structural statement. Canada is not waiting for permission. It is expanding Arctic defense partnerships with Germany, Norway, and the Nordic and Baltic states. It is taking control of its own northern frontier, independent of Washington's posture. That leaves one question that no one in Washington appears ready to answer. NORAD still exists. The U.S.-Canada Defense Partnership is still operational. But alongside it, a new architecture is forming. $35 billion in Arctic investment, a $40 billion submarine fleet built with European and Pacific partners, expanding ties with Germany, Japan, South Korea, and Australia. This new coalition is not being built against America. It is being built without meeting America. That is a different equation entirely. For 6 decades, the assumption was security runs through Washington. There was no alternative. Now there is one forming, in real time, in the Arctic, piece by piece. When Trump lifted sanctions on Russian oil against the unified objection of 6 allies, he did more than upset diplomats. He opened the door for Russian crude to re-enter global markets at the moment Europe is trying to cut its energy dependence on Moscow. Meanwhile, Canada holds the 3rd largest oil reserves on the planet, along with uranium, nickel, cobalt, and rare earth elements that Western and Asian defense supply chains are actively scrambling to secure. The old playbook is gone. The assumption that America will always be the reliable anchor of the Western alliance has been tested to its breaking point. What replaces it will define the next decade. Canada is already doing the calculations in investments, in partnerships, in the calm, precise way its Prime Minister dismantled a hostile economic narrative on live television in the Arctic cold. The question is not whether a crack has appeared in NATO. It has. The question is what gets built in the space it opened. If you want to follow how it develops, the submarine deals, the Arctic investments, the alliance shifts, subscribe and hit the bell. The next update will not wait for the headlines to catch up.